Welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, Chancellor's Professor of Political Science and Director of Community Engagement at Indiana University South Bend. Today, we turn our attention to immigration. We'll discuss the U.S. immigration system, the impact of immigration enforcement on local communities, and the potential implications of Donald Trump's plan to launch the largest deportation program in U.S. history. To help us explore these crucial issues, we're joined by Rudy Monterosa, an experienced immigration and criminal defense attorney and founder of the Monterosa Law Group. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
Now, I want to ask you, as somebody who is deeply involved in immigration cases, what are some of the challenges that the immigrant community is facing in Indiana and elsewhere?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this program. We always appreciate being able to show both sides of the story when we talk to our audience. I believe the challenges that immigrants have had in Indiana and throughout the country is the fact that I think sometimes people aren't very well educated about the system of immigration in our country. I think that if people were educated about it and knew about it and didn't just rely on what's posted on social media or what's said on the campaign trail, I think that if people were educated and saw exactly what was happening or how our system works, then I think people might have a different reaction. And I think this is especially true when you start meeting somebody or when you realize that you know somebody that's going through this process, either of legalization or becoming a U.S. citizen, or perhaps somebody that's going through the deportation proceeding. Then I think when people see that it's a human being, then I think at that point people see it differently. There's a reason why, for example, President-elect Trump had said these illegals or illegal aliens is because you dehumanize a person when you refer to them as an other. But it's not as easy to deport Joey, who plays soccer with your son, or it's not as easy to deport Mary, whose real name was Maria, but who's a person that you've known for years but didn't realize that they had these immigration issues. So I believe it's a matter of education, and I believe it's a matter of realizing the humanity in people, and that when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about families, we're talking about communities, and we're talking about human beings that have, for whatever reason, decided to make the United States their home. And this country is we're founded on immigrants, and we thrive because immigrants have come to this country and have been able to work hard and contribute and do something positive with our country. And I think I think that's the bottom line. I think it matters. It goes down to education. People really need to know how the system works.
So many people, even those who recognize we're a country of immigrants, say, but that's fine, just do it legally. So what are the paths for people who are trying to immigrate here and would like to do so through one of those legal paths that they have? And what are some of the challenges that people have pursuing that legal immigration that they might desire?
So when people say, well, why don't you do the things the right way or do it legally, let us recall that before the 1800s, you'll see the scene from The Godfather, right? Where Don Corleone comes to Ellis Island and they thought that he had a disease or they thought that he was sick. They quarantined him and then they allowed him into the United States. So it used to be that if you wanted to come here and work hard, you would be able to come in. There wasn't this concept of you have to show documentation in order to be able to come to the United States. There came a point where we stopped being that way, including where we made people that were in the United States already, that were a part of this country, and now we made them into the saying that the border didn't cross me. I didn't cross the border crossed me, right? There were people here already in the United States that were already a part of it, but yet then became another because of the way we drew our border lines. If you want to do things legally nowadays, the system that we have relies on someone being a sponsor, with the work that we do. So generally speaking, it's either an employer or a family member. So a U.S. citizen can submit what's called an I-130, a petition for an alien relative. And that petition says, I'm a U.S. citizen, and this person, either my spouse, my parent, my spouse, my child, under the age of 21, over the age of 21, married, unmarried, and my brother and sister. Those are individuals that person can apply for. If you have a green card, you can only apply for your wife, your spouse, I should say, or your child, so long as they're not married. If you're fortunate enough to be a U.S. citizen and you qualify as an immediate relative, which is the parent, spouse, child under the age of 21 who's unmarried, then you have a visa that's immediately available. So the first step is to establish that you have a foundation. In other words, there's a visa available for you to be able to come into the United States. So that's the first step, to recognize that you have a right to come into the United States. But the second step is actually applying to legalize your status. And that's where things get complicated. So a lot of times people may have entered the United States lawfully. If they entered lawfully and they're an immediate relative, then despite the fact that they may have worked unlawfully or they may have been in the United States unlawfully, they have an opportunity to be able to legalize their status here in the United States. But if you entered unlawfully, or if you entered lawfully, overstayed your visa, and then because you're not an immediate relative, then that means that you'd have to leave the United States in order to legalize your status. But back in 1996, we passed, that's the last time we had significant immigration reform in this country. And what we did then is that we said that if you've been in the United States longer than 6 months but less than a year, and you leave the country, you can't come back for 3 years. And if you've been in the United States longer than a year and you leave, you can't come back for 10 years. And if you've been in the United States longer than a year, you leave and you come back without permission from the Attorney General, then you can never come back. It's called a permanent bar. The idea of having passed that law was that people would stop coming to the United States if they knew that if they left, they wouldn't be able to come back for 10 years. It had the opposite effect. Instead of people going back and forth, because it used to be that some people would come here, work, and they would go back to their country. Come here, work, and they would go back to their country. When this law had passed, then that encouraged folks, well, I'm not going to go back, and they stayed. And so then now they started having families or would get married, and that example that I gave you before where a family member can petition for this individual, now the lawyer is telling them that if you want to legalize your status, you have to leave the country. But that means you have to leave the country for 3 years, 10 years, or for life, that you have to stay outside of the United States for a certain period of time before you're able to come back. So that's one issue. The other is that if you're not an immediate relative and a visa is not immediately available, then that means you have to wait in line. And if you're waiting in line, that can be anywhere it could be as short as 2 years if you're lucky enough to be the spouse of a legal permanent resident from anywhere else in the world other than Mexico, the Philippines, India, and China that have the most serious backlogs. But if you're the brother of a U.S. citizen and you're from the Philippines, you're waiting in line for about 20 years. So when we talk about individuals, the last number I heard was about 14 million that were people that were in the United States undocumented, that didn't have lawful status. What they don't really explain is that of those 14 million people, some of them may very well have a petition that's already been submitted. They are waiting in line. It's just taking 15, 20 years for them to be able to get to the point where they can even apply. And when they get to the point where they can even apply, it's a matter of whether or not they qualify under an exception to be able to legalize their status here in the United States, or if they're going to have to go through this other process that I talked about, which is leaving the country. There's waivers that exist. There's a waiver that exists to waive that 3 and the 10-year bar, and also the permanent bar under certain conditions. Typically, though, that's for individuals that are married to a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, that their spouse is a legal permanent resident, or the children of parents that are legal permanent residents or U.S. citizens. But recall that we have heads of households, parents that are undocumented, whose children now can petition for them, and the children now turn 21, they can petition for them, and there's a visa immediately available. But with the parent, they would have to leave in order to legalize their status. And now we're telling parents that there's no waiver, unfortunately, for parents. And so if they leave the U.S., they would have to stay outside of the United States for a period of 10 years. And so that makes it very difficult for families, especially when, ironically enough, it's the head of household who's undocumented, but somehow or another they're making ends meet. And to tell that family that the head of household would have to leave for 10 years before they would be able to come back, It makes it difficult. And so those are part of the issues with regard to legalization.
So we talked about waiting in line. That line could be a couple of decades, either because you're from China, Philippines, and Mexico, and that is the soonest you're going to get in through this more extended period if you don't have an immediate family member, or you might have to leave for an extended period of time. So it's not as easy as filling out the correct paperwork.
Right. We wish that it was, right? Now, sometimes people will ask me, well, I've been in the United States for so long, doesn't that count for something? It does if you're in deportation proceedings, but the one point I wanted to make is we do have a law that's called registry. And that one says that if you've been in the United States since January 1st of 1972, you can fill out the paperwork and legalize your status. But a lot of those folks have already legalized their status. There's not many, well, I was born in 1973, so there's still some of us that are alive. but when they afforded that opportunity for individuals to be able to fill out that paperwork, that time has already passed for many of those folks, or they've already legalized, or they've already become U.S. citizens. So there has been talk, and actually this is what I would encourage the new administration to do, that it's not about deporting everybody from the United States, like what we've heard throughout this campaign. It's not about deporting people from the United States. It's about coming up with a realistic immigration system so that people can do things the right way, so that we minimize illegal immigration, because people do want to do things the right way. And I'll give you an example. There were, under the Biden administration, there were people that were coming from the United States. They had an opportunity, they called it family reunification. They had an opportunity to be able to be with their loved ones. So I believe it was Venezuela, Honduras, and I forget the other country, but there were some countries that the United States had designated that said, look, if you submit the paperwork and you submit an affidavit of support, somebody that can be responsible for you, you can come here for a temporary period of time, be able to work, and at least you're here with your family. These were folks that were waiting for a petition that their family had filed, something along those lines. The government specifically sent out letters to these individuals, and that's how you knew if you qualified for it. It wasn't something that you could affirmatively apply for. What they saw that people from those countries, the numbers went down at the border. So they sought the legal means to do it. And so what's the advantage of doing things about providing immigration reform? The advantage is that you would be able to have people come out of the woodworks, turn in the paperwork, you know exactly where they are, you know exactly who they are, and they can contribute to our base, not underground, right? Because we know that the United States has a lot of individuals, and certainly here in our community, people that are working unlawfully, that the industry relies on them, whether we like to believe that or not. The industries rely on it. You know, here next door we have Elkhart County, the RV industry. In our area we have the hotel, the service industry, what's labor intensive, the farms, right? Agriculture. So there's people out there. I'm not saying that everybody that's working out there is undocumented, but what I am saying is we know that there are folks that are, and that these industries rely on them. And if you're able to provide a legal means for people to work, people are going to take advantage of that, are going to want to do that the right way. And so I think that doesn't disrupt families, that doesn't disrupt communities, and it still allows us to be able to take advantage or be able to still enjoy the fruits of these labors from people that are members of our community, that come from mixed status families, that we don't, well, my feeling is that these are not individuals that we want to leave the United States, because they made the United States what it is.
And this will be one of the interesting things to see how business responds to any attempt to deport everybody with undocumented status, and what kind of work visas are put in place, if any, before that would happen. Because as you suggested, often what happens in various states is that the leaders of the state and of the cities will urgently tell their members of Congress, we can't afford to lose all of these workers. What can you do for us?
Yeah, the good example of that was what happened in Georgia, right? Georgia had passed some very anti-immigrant laws, and so people left. The undocumented along with the documented. They felt that it was a hostile environment, and so they had crops that were dying. They had work that was not being completed. And they saw, well, wait a minute, okay, maybe we went a little bit too far. And reversed on that so that people would go back and that labor could still happen. So I think what we really need to take into account is when we have this rhetoric, this dangerous rhetoric about illegal immigration, or when we start demonizing illegal immigrants, We can't tell, just like you can't tell who is a U.S. citizen because we're so diverse, you can't tell who's undocumented. We're so diverse. So it could be that because of the color of our skin that we would be targeted, though we may be a U.S. citizen or a legal immigrant or somebody that has some form of lawful status. When you demonize one person, in my view, you demonize all. And I think that that's the danger in this rhetoric and this demonization of immigrants or even undocumented or otherwise, of creating this other. And I think that's the danger. I think that's what we have to be careful with.
Are you noticing some anxiety on that level of people who are here legally, maybe have been here for years, perhaps even generations, who are concerned about what may happen if we do experience a wide-scale deportation effort or an additional sort of intensifying of anti-immigrant rhetoric?
So now that as we wait on what's going to happen under this new administration, we have the benefit of hindsight, and that is that we already went through the Trump administration once. And so we saw what he was able to enforce. We saw what became a priority. We saw how the community reacted and how also those that supported immigrants were able to stand up. So I believe that the fact that we have had response from folks that are here lawfully, right, that are concerned. So now what we're starting to see is that then people are perhaps interested in applying for citizenship because they know that if they apply for citizenship, then okay, then I'm safe. They're not going to remove me. Although under the last administration, President Trump did create this denaturalization task force where they were looking for people that were already U.S. citizens and making an effort to find a reason why they shouldn't have been given citizenship in the first place, which I thought was an extreme, but it did happen. Well, the task force was created, not that they were actually successful with doing so. When we talk, you mentioned earlier about mass deportation. The last time this happened was under President Eisenhower's administration. It was in the 50s. And when we talk to our community or to my students and we talk to them about mass deportation, I would present it as the shocker, right? Can you believe that in the United States we actually had a mass deportation, that this actually happened? Such that when we would teach that class, we would say, well, but this could never happen again because we're in such a better place, and now here we are. But what we learned from that time when that happened was that when mass deportation occurred, the sweeping the immigration raids, they removed U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, and the undocumented. So if mass deportation were really to go into effect the way President Trump or President-elect Trump has been talking about, then I'm at risk, right? Because of the color of my skin, because I am a Latino man. And again, you can't tell by looking at me whether I'm a U.S. citizen or undocumented unless I can show you the paperwork. So that we know that happened before, and so if we implement this mass deportation, we know that it can happen again. But I think that's also the other side, right? I'm not going to let myself be deported. I'm also not going to let my community member, my fellow brother and sister, for them to be deported. The bottom line is that in the United States of America, if you're here and you have planted yourself within the U.S., you're protected by the Constitution of the United States. Everybody is entitled to due process. So even if they try to remove somebody from the United States, you have a right to be heard before a judge, to have a hearing before a judge, and the judge is going to make the call on whether or not you can be removed. And then that begs the question, then how are we going to deal with this influx? Because we already have an immigration court system now that is backlogged. And so, and a lot of that backlog you can also attribute it to during the last administration because two things happened during then. One was the Trump administration, the other was COVID. With COVID, we saw the whole world shut down, so that had an impact with immigration cases and the immigration court system. But with the Trump administration, the last time he said his priorities, typically under the Biden administration, under the Obama administration, the priorities have been if somebody is a threat to national security or is a terrorist, or if they've been convicted of a felony, those are the individuals that we're going to be targeting.
Because we did see a high number of deportations
Right.
under both of those
Exactly.
administrations.
But it was more efficient, and we saw that because it was efficient. They were targeting those individuals, and those were the priorities. You're absolutely correct. But under the Trump administration, his priorities were, if you've ever been convicted of any crime, you're a priority. If you've been charged with the crime but you weren't found guilty, you're a priority. If you could have been charged with the crime but you weren't charged with the crime, you're a priority. And if the officer sees you and thinks that you're a threat to national security, you're a priority. So in doing that, everybody was a priority. And when everybody was a priority, that word did not exist. It didn't make sense. Nobody was a priority. So this idea of being able to remove everybody and prioritizing everybody, it just doesn't function, because it takes too much money, it takes too much time, it takes too many resources to actually implement that. So
Is this sort of the answer to that puzzle that some people ask, which is, why is it that Donald Trump talked a lot about deportation, but Barack Obama actually appeared to deport more people? What was going on there? And what you're saying is it was just a different, more targeted effort of people who were, the courts would approve for removal, and so those targeted cases were successful versus
Right.
this much more general approach.
Right, exactly.
Okay, now if we think about Donald Trump's promise, which is, and he says he will keep the promises that he made in the campaign, one of which is to lead the largest deportation effort in U.S. history and to use the military to carry it out. What would be the effect of that on not just undocumented people, but communities in general?
Well, I believe that's the concern, that if in fact sweeping immigration raids do take place, then I believe that there will be people that are placed in removal proceedings, or that there's going to be an effort to deport of individuals that have every right to be here and that should not be targeted, but because maybe they don't have the paperwork with them or what have you, could be a target, right? So I think there's going to be false arrest if this were to happen. I don't believe that this can actually take place.
You think the courts will step in, or why do you not believe that?
Well, first of all, the president may say one thing, but what the other bodies and what other agencies say within our country are saying another, right? So the president's saying that he's going to use the military, and the military is going to enforce this role of mass deportation. But what we've heard military officials say is that we can't take an active role, because that's not our role, that's not our duty, that's not what we're called upon to do. To the extent that they might provide backup services, like for example, I think what he indicated was the National Guard or something like that, then perhaps in that level. But the idea that the military would be the ones that are actively engaged in removing individuals, I don't believe that he'll be able to do that. And I think the military has come out to indicate that they wouldn't do that either. What you could see is an increase with ICE personnel, Immigration and Customs Enforcement personnel, such that they would try to identify those individuals. I think, so let's, on the one hand, as much as I want to be optimistic, I think the other part is we also have to be realistic. So I do believe that one thing that we can be concerned about, or that we may expect, is that they would target those individuals that have been removed before from the United States and that are in the United States. And in fact, during the Trump administration, we saw that, and I expect that it would happen again, which is the increase of federal immigration crimes. So it's 8 U.S.C. 1325 and 8 U.S.C. 1326, which was entering the United States unlawfully or entering the United States unlawfully after you had already been removed. We've seen an increase of those types of those crimes, even in our community. Typically, you would see those crimes being charged around the border communities. But we see them here in Indiana, that if they've identified somebody who's been deported before, the U.S. government can charge them federally for having entered illegally after they'd already been deported. So we do expect that we'd see an increase in that, and we do expect that they would target those individuals, or at least place those people in removal proceedings. I think that's the easiest one for the government to do, which is to reinstate deportation orders that already existed before, or to identify those individuals that are here after they had already been removed. That's a concern. And the other, it's kind of hard to argue this one, those people that have been convicted of the most serious crimes. I mean, it's kind of, well, it's not as hard to argue when it's your family member, right? When it's your family member, but at the same time, we recognize that if it's somebody that committed a heinous crime, we're talking murder, rape, sexual abuse of a minor, or illicit trafficking, or a drug trafficking crime, those are individuals that are going to be there's going to be a focus on people that were convicted of those types of crimes, and certainly those are the people that would be removed because they've been convicted of an aggravated felony. If you've been convicted of an aggravated felony, then that certainly is going to put you at risk of being deported. And I would expect that that's what we would see an increase of. So if somebody's been in the U.S., although they may have been here unlawfully, but has no prior criminal history whatsoever, I don't think that those are the individuals that are going to be arrested. I think that who the administration is going to be targeting, because it's going to be easily identifiable, are those individuals that have prior deportation orders or those individuals that have been convicted of serious crimes.
So at least in the first stage, that's what we would expect, and the rest remains to be seen, as well as whether there will be any hope for more comprehensive immigration reform. Thank you so much for explaining the system to us and sharing your insights with us. That's all the time we have for this week's Politically Speaking. I want to thank our guest, Attorney Rudy Monterosa, for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Bennion, reminding you that it takes all of us to make democracy work. We'll see you next time.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.